A federal judge has ruled that Americans, specifically students in Detroit, do not have a right to literacy. In fact, they have no right to access to literacy. As long as there are public schools that are being run, that's all that matters. The law is being followed. Now, this all stems from a federal lawsuit that was filed by students in Detroit, and it was because of the conditions that they were learning in. In fact, they weren't learning anything at all because the schools were severely underfunded and didn't even have the resources necessary to learn. So a handful of Detroit students charged in federal court that educational officials in Michigan, including Governor Rick Snyder, denied them access to an education of any quality. So if you don't believe me, here are some of the issues with these Detroit schools. Overcrowded classrooms, lack of textbooks and basic materials, unqualified staff, leaking roofs, broken windows, black mold, which by the way causes cancer, contaminated drinking water, rodents, no pens, no paper, no toilet paper, and unsafe temperatures that had classes canceled due to 90-degree heat or classrooms so cold students could see their breath. Now, a lot of that has to do with these terrible buildings and unsafe conditions that the students were trying to learn in. But when it comes to the quality of education itself, there were instances where there were no teachers in the class and the students were left to teach themselves. The lawsuit even mentions one 8th grade student who taught a 7th and 8th grade math class for a month because no teacher could be found.
So I want to pause there because that story was powerful and it really got to me. Oftentimes right-wingers will yell at African-American communities, honestly, and say, why don't you pull yourselves up by the bootstraps? But there are no bootstraps. So not only do they have no toilet paper, black mold, I mean, it's a disaster area, right? But they have no pens and they have no paper. So how are they supposed to do homework? How are they supposed to do any work? A lot of these classrooms have either ridiculously old books or no books at all. But to me, the lack of a teacher was so over the top, I can't fathom it. Can you imagine for any of you, if when you were going to school or if you're a parent, if your kid's going to school and they're like, oh, by the way, they're just not gonna have a teacher for a whole month. And that young kid, an 8th grader in that community, steps up and starts teaching his fellow students.
Peers, yeah.
And then they yell at that community for not doing enough.
No, this ruling actually sets a devastating precedent that not only impacts these schools in Detroit, but impacts every public school in every country. And I'll explain why in just a minute. But the plaintiffs essentially looked to the Constitution and they cited the equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection clauses of the 14th Amendment, right? And so they're arguing, hey, look at what schools in Detroit are like compared to other schools in the state of Michigan. There's no equality here. We are being severely underfunded. We are not being taken care of. We're being completely, ignored. And we're supposed to be learning in these incredibly unsafe, unhealthy conditions with no resources, no materials, no pens, no papers. And the judge said, yeah, you really have no right to literacy. And so if that's the ruling by the judge when it comes to these Detroit schools, that sets the precedent for all these other schools, right?
Yeah.
Because if you're in a state, let's say you are a liberal municipality in an incredibly conservative state, red state, and the governor decides, yeah, I'm okay with this school district being underfunded or ignored. I'm not gonna look out for them. I'm not gonna protect them. I don't care about them. He has the right to do so as long as that school is still running. Let me just read one quote from the judge and then jump in, Cenk. He says, access to literacy is not a fundamental right. Accordingly, the state's alleged failure to provide literacy access to plaintiffs fails to state an equal protection claim on the basis of burdening a fundamental right. The court is left to conclude that the Supreme Court has neither confirmed nor denied that access to literacy is a fundamental right. The court must therefore cautiously take up the task.
Yeah, so, that means you don't have a right to an education. That means that we could just turn the schools in areas we don't like or care about at all into warehouses. You must go to school. We're not going to educate you at that school because you don't have a right to literacy. We're just gonna house you there. And maybe we'll arrest some of you from time to time, but it's like a holding cell, if you will. We are now back at pre-civil rights era, separate but equal. You go to some of the private schools in the good cities, okay, and they are spectacular. You wouldn't believe the facilities that they have. And then there are schools, sometimes in the same exact city, where they have no paper, no pen, there's rats running around in the hallways, there's no teachers, and then the courts go, yeah, no, they're separate, but they look equal to me.
I mean, in this case though, there's absolutely no concern about whether or not these schools are equal. There's an acknowledgement that they're not equal.
Yeah, right? In a sense, it's worse than the separate but equal phase in American history, where we pretended that the schools were equal when the black kids were being sent to terrible schools and the white kids were sent to good schools. Now we're saying, no, I know they're not equal and I don't care. So your kids will rot and my kids will be in great shape and you'll just have to deal with that. It's gross.
It is gross. And keep in mind that historically, governments have wanted to keep the masses uneducated. Historically, they've wanted people to be illiterate. In US history, the slaves were forced to be illiterate. They were not allowed to learn to read.
Yeah, I went to a plantation in South Carolina when I was there, and they explained that one of the strictest rules they had was that no slave was ever allowed to learn how to read. And so there was severe punishment if you were allowed to learn. Because if you learned and you got an education, well, you might realize that you should rebel. You should rebel against the system. And then they would turn around and go, well, they can't be educated. Well, if they can't be educated, then why do you have a sign that says, and a rule that says, don't educate them? You know they can be educated. Yeah. They knew it all along, and that's exactly what they were afraid of.
Knowledge is power. And when you are knowledgeable, you can fight back, and governments don't want that.
2 easy ways to follow the Young Turks. One is hit the subscribe button down below, then you're a TYT subscriber. And second is ring the bell. And when you do that on YouTube, you're notified of our videos.